Welcome back to Refrigeration Training Ireland 3D Interactive Learning Technologies. We have, this is video 2, so this is a two-part video. So if you remember last week, we put on our gauge manifold, we went through the purge system, we remembered how to work our access service valve. So again, just to remind ourselves, the service valve is in the cracked position. When we started, before we put the hose on, it was in the back seat position. So again, without repeating everything that I've said earlier, you all understand at this stage, back seat, put your service line on, crack to get actual pressure in your gauge itself. Now we also remembered as well from last week that we went through the purging sequence. We connected onto our recovery unit. Again, we put it through this the service line that is actually going to suck the refrigerant out is on the suction side of the recovery unit, and then the discharge side. And then if you remember, we also went through the process of purging these lines back as far as the bottle, and we also went through the process of identifying the recovery bottle and making sure that the recovery bottle had enough capacity in it to be able to put refrigerant into it. So we have a recovery bottle sitting on a weighing scales. We can see that the combined amount of refrigerant and the weight of the actual bottle itself is 10.32 kgs. And again, we remember from looking at earlier what our tar rate was on the actual bottle. So the weight of the bottle when it's empty is 9.16. This is a tar rate here, 9.16. So if I take my 9.16 from my 10.3, the difference between the two tells me how much refrigerant is in the system. And again, we can remember from last week, we have a max recovery on this particular system is 10 kgs on this particular bottle. If I lift up the net, you can see max refill 10 kgs. So we know that we take 60% of the total weight. So the most refrigerant we can put into this is 6 kgs. So by the time I finish, this weight here shouldn't exceed 16 kgs, which should be the total weight by the time we're finished recovering. So we're ready to switch on, and again, so what we're going to do now is we're recovering in liquid because it's a zeotropic blend. So because we've done our purge sequence, there's no need for me to do it again. I have the bottle open at this stage, just to check. So the bottle is open from the last video. Now what has happened is the pressures have equalized across. So again, if you can remember, when we started off here, we had about 8 or 9 psi. When we started up, it was up here at about 8.5, 9 bar, should I say 9 bar pressure. Now you can see where we're down to 5 bar and 5 bar. So what's actually happened is we've allowed the refrigerant to circulate through into the recovery bottle or into the recovery machine and back into the bottle. So you can actually see on our recovery machine, we've got pressure inside on the low side, we've pressure on the high side. Again, if you look closely, it's PSI in this case, so it's there. It's just over 50, 60 PSI, just under 100 PSI on the high side. So we convert that back into bar, whatever that is in bar. Oh yeah, we have a bar. It's 5 bar here in the red, and you can see it's just under 5 bar here. The blue line represents bar. So there's 5 bar in the recovery unit. There's 5 bar in the system. There's 5 bar in the bottle. So we've equalized. So now we, by just allowing it to equalize across, we can't get any more refrigerant out of the system. So we're going to switch on the recovery unit. Again, recovering in liquid. This is an oilless compressor inside this, so this is capable of recovering liquid, and that's why we have our liquid valve. And as I say, we always try and recover zeotropic blends in liquid, and we certainly always charge up zeotropic blends in liquid form. So the next video next week that you're going to see is us charging this system with liquid refrigerant and showing you how to do it. Okay, so I'm just going to switch this on. And I have to open my high side gauge, which I've done there. Now normally what we would also do, because we could either open or low side, but then that would be vapor. So really what we want to do in order to pull out the liquid, we just have to make sure that the solenoid is energized on this system. So we literally go to our on this particular case, we just energize the solenoid. So all I've done is just energize the solenoid, and that allows for any liquid that's on the low side. We can now see the needle on the low side moving because my solenoid is energized. So basically all the refrigerant is being pulled from the low side through into the high side, and from the high side through the service valve into the recovery unit. So you can see the gauge is moving down as the recovery unit is working, and what we can also notice is that there is slight increase in the actual weight of our bottle as well, so the weighing scales. So we can see the weight going up, we can see the pressures coming down. This pressure is staying up higher. You can see where we have our it's about 10 bar pressure now on the high side of our recovery unit. So the 10 bar pressure is needed because our bottle, if you remember, our bottle when it was standing there was at about 5-6 bars. So we need to get a higher pressure on the high side of the recovery unit to force the refrigerant into the bottle. So you can see it's moving quite slowly. You can see we're at 10.4, but you can see the low side is getting closer and closer to zero. You can see the low side on our system is getting closer and closer to zero. So that's telling me that what's happening is that the refrigerant is being recovered from my system, from my refrigerated cabinet, and it is being sucked into the recovery unit. And you can say that the majority of it is actually remaining in the recovery unit simply because we still have 10 bar at the high side. So the majority of the refrigerant, and because we're not really moving a whole lot on our bottle or on our weighing scales here, so the majority of the refrigerant is staying here in the recovery unit. So what we will need to do, and it's very important that you remember this, at the end of this process we will need to get whatever excess refrigerant is in this recovery unit back into the actual bottle itself. So that's why on this particular system it's got a purge feature. So we will be switching over to the purge feature, and the purge feature is literally, or the purge option is literally to give a false back pressure on the actual unit so that it will force the remaining refrigerant that's left inside in the recovery unit, it will force it into the actual bottle. Now, on other systems, so this is just a particular type of manufacturer, it's a typical type of recovery unit. On other systems you might find instead of it saying purge, it might say self-clean. So self-clean is the same option as well. So literally purge or self-clean is the option that or the step that we have to take at the end of recovery to empty the recovery unit of any excess refrigerant that's in it. So if we look at our unit now, we can see how quickly we're down at zero, Now I don't want this to go into a vacuum, so literally what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to switch off my gauge manifold because I don't want to start pulling air into the system if there was a potential leak or whatever. So I'm just closing this down. And by closing this down, you can see straight away that recovery completes. So in other words, this system here, because it's at zero, this actual recovery system has its own LP cutout. So therefore, it has cut out on LP on the recovery unit. Now, we're at zero and we're at zero. Don't be concerned if you start to see this over time start to slightly increase and slightly rise. If it's doing it very quickly, it means that we have to start again and put the recovery unit back on. But it's staying quite still here at the moment. But after a period of time, so say maybe by the end of this video, you might see that there's a slight increase in that. And the reason for that is no matter what we do, there's going to be residual refrigerant left inside in the oil of the compressor. So there's still, if I was to open this compressor, or if there was a drain on it and I was to drain the oil out of it, you would actually see the oil starting to bubble away or flash away. And the reason for that is because of the fact that the oil is miscible with the refrigerant, so the refrigerant is going to stay in the oil. So over a period of time, that's going to start creeping up. Now, it's not commercially viable for us to stay here and try and remove all that oil. It would take forever. It would take an excessive amount of time, which would make it, in commercial terms, it would make it a very expensive process to try and go through recovery if we were to try and remove all that refrigerant. So there's the inadvertent venting again. So if you were to remove the oil from that compressor and there was bubbling taking place, that's inadvertent gas escaping to the atmosphere. We'll try to avoid that, but as I say, you have to do what's within commercially viable as well as environmental friendly. Now the other thing you've noticed, because I haven't done anything else, this keeps banging in and out on its LP. So what's happening is the back pressure is still rising. So that would account for the oil and so on. Back pressure is still rising. It's gone in, cutting back in, and then coming back out in LP. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to change this valve over to purge. And by changing it over to purge, you can see now, see the way we've got this really false back pressure. So there's no refrigerant actually in the system. The system is designed to give you a false back pressure, which will force the remaining refrigerant in the high side out of the actual recovery unit. And eventually you'll see this will get to zero, this will get to zero, and when the two get to zero, then the unit itself cuts out on LP. Now again, be warned, be familiar with your recovery unit, because some recovery units actually don't have LP cut out. So again, you've got to check that out. They may have HP cut out and not LP cut out. Now you can see we're at zero, we've recovery complete. So now we can literally power off the unit, put the valve into off, and we've now completed our recovery. Our line is at zero, and you can see that this is at 0 and 0. So there's no refrigerant left in the system. There's no refrigerant left in the recovery bottle. We can actually now see how much refrigerant, so we've gone up to 10.51. So if you can remember at the beginning of the video what we started off, and you extract that, I think it was 10.32 or something like that. So you can see it's a very small amount of refrigerant that we've actually removed from the system. But we still have capacity in that bottle. So the last thing that we need to do now is we need to close our bottle. And again, remember from last week I said we put it on the vapor side. And I'm now going to close it. The reason why we put it on the vapor side is that when I take this line off here, there will be no refrigerant. So you didn't hear anything. There's no refrigerant in that line because we sucked it all out of the unit, okay? When I go and I take off this line here, there will be refrigerant in it. It is not, again, viably possible or commercially possible to remove all the refrigerant, simply because what has happened is, even though there's no refrigerant in this recovery unit, there is refrigerant in the bottle, and because we had the bottle open, the refrigerant is still present in the actual hose line itself. So now that I've closed the vapor, there is only vapor in this line. If I had made the mistake and putting it on my liquid side and actually put it through my liquid port, then there would be liquid in this, and we don't want liquid in our line. We don't want to allow a liquid to escape the atmosphere for both environmental reasons and for the fact that it's also a health and safety hazard. So when I go to disconnect this from the bottle, you're going to hear some refrigerant escaping, and that's why we try and keep these lines as short as possible. So there's one kind of line that's short. But over here from my other unit here, I have another type of line, and you can see that's even shorter again. So the shorter I can keep my lines, the better, because it means then the smaller amount of refrigerant is going to escape the atmosphere. So that's kind of the shortest, a really nice short line. So when we go to take this line off, we will end up with a small amount of refrigerant escaping. So when I go on, so that is the small amount of refrigerant that remained in that line that has escaped from that line. So that is the completed recovery of refrigerant. We're now in a position to, and one of the things that you'll always end up doing is we'll end up putting a cover. So if there was a kind of a cap or whatever on top of our bottle, so it's just good practice if we end up just keeping the bottle itself covered, okay? And the last thing we need to do as well before we move on to carrying out the repair is we need to get ourselves a label. So usually what you'll find is we either use a black marker for the actual bottle itself if you're staying within company, or just get one of these sticky back address type labels. And literally what we need to be able to do is we need to be able to put on the details of the refrigerant. So you'll put on the date, you'll put on your name as the engineer, you will put on the type of refrigerant that you brought in, and then you'll put on whether it's recovered, reclaimed, or recycled. So it won't be recycled because that's done at factory. It's recovered in our particular case because we literally didn't do any kind of cleaning process. We didn't put any filter dryers on. So then you decide whether you put on the label whether it's good refrigerant or refrigerant for disposal. If it needs to be sent for disposable, make sure before you take it away from your customer that you fill out a waste transfer note. So any refrigerant or any refrigerant oil or any kind of waste that you need to send away for destruction, it has to be, it's covered under the EPA. Again, it's covered under the Environmental Protection Act. It's deemed as a hazardous waste. It's not your waste, it belongs to your customer. So the first thing your customer needs to complete, or you need to complete on behalf of your customer, is a waste transfer note. The second thing you need to do is you need to make sure that you're PAN registered. So that's prior annual notification. Check out the EPA website about prior annual notification. If you're PAN registered, that allows you to take the hazardous waste or the refrigerant waste and the oil waste from your customer site direct to the point of disposal. Don't bring it back to your warehouse because you don't have a license to store it in your warehouse. So you bring it from your customer site back to the point of disposal. Make sure then that when you are getting it disposed of that you get a certificate of destruction, and keep a copy so your customer has a copy and you have a copy, to make sure that if the EPA has a visit and they ask where is this refrigerant that was introduced to the market, you can show your certificate of destruction and show that it was disposed of properly in an environmental way. So just remember, PAN registered, certificate of destruction. Now I hear some of you saying, that's ridiculous, sure, I won't have time to go to a waste site today because I have 6 other calls to do. So what you do is your customer is allowed to keep their waste on their site for up to 6 months, but a maximum of 6 months. So if you're not in a position to take that recovery bottle, make sure you label it, make sure you have it identified that it's for destruction, make sure you put it into your diary that you have to collect that before the 6 months run out so that you can get that, or else You can leave it with your customer, and it's up to them then to make sure that they get a company with a hazardous waste license to remove that refrigerant from their premises. But normally what happens, as a contractor, the customer expects you to do it, waste transfer note, back to the point where the depot that is to be actually disposed of. Don't store it in your own warehouse, because you don't own that refrigerant, so you can't store it in your own warehouse unless you have a hazardous waste license, which no refrigeration contractor would have, because it's not commercially viable for them to go through the process of getting one and maintaining one. So that's the end of this video. Thanks for watching. There'll be more videos next week. We'll do a nitrogen pressure test next week, and then we'll move on from there, and we'll recharge the system, vacuum and recharge the system. Okay, that's it. Me for now. Thank you.